Once a major player in the airline industry, Continental Airlines went through a series of ups and downs throughout its history. From its founding in 1934 to its merger with United Airlines in 2010, Continental Airlines faced numerous challenges, including financial struggles, bankruptcy, and intense competition. However, despite these challenges, the airline managed to innovate and adapt to changing market conditions, ultimately becoming one of the most successful airlines in the United States in the 1990s after suffering a brutal decade in the 1980s. But along the way, Continental also faced controversy and tragedy, but its stunning redemption is what can make it most notable. This is the story of the slow rise of Continental, its downfall, its unforeseen redemption, and finally, its demise. To understand Continental's beginnings, we need to go back to the early 1920s when Continental and United were once one airline. Kind of. William T. Varney started an airmail company in 1925 named Varney Speed Lines that served routes across the continental United States. And it performed pretty well as airmail was more in demand than passenger travel. However, 9 years later, in 1934, there was an airmail scandal that resulted in President Roosevelt passing the Airmail Act, which prevented aircraft manufacturers from operating airlines. As a result, the company that owned Varney Speed Lines, United Aircraft and Transport Corporation, was broken up and reformed into the airline we know today as United Airlines, and William Varney decided to stick with United. However, this is where an important person comes into the picture, a young businessman from California named Robert F. Six. Six was interested in buying the Southwest division of Varney Speed Lines, which needed some money to handle its Pueblo to El Paso route it was recently awarded. Six bought into the airline for $90,000 and became the general manager in 1936. He renamed the airline Continental Airlines in 1937. That same year, they moved their headquarters to Denver. As the 1940s dawned, the airline allowed the U.S. Air Force to use their Denver maintenance base during World War II to convert B-17s, B-29s, and P-51s. After the war, they used the profits they made from aircraft conversion and military transportation to purchase new and improved aircraft after the war ended, such as the DC-3, Convair 240, and Convair 340. These new airliners allowed them to open up new routes from El Paso, with the first one being El Paso to Albuquerque to Denver. Over the next few years, they opened up routes across Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas. As the 1950s came, Continental began several interchange routes with American, Braniff, and United, which helped them open up new routes to the rest of the continental United States. In 1955, Continental merged with Pioneer Airlines, which expanded its routes across Texas and New Mexico. Pioneer's vice president, Harding Lawrence, was one of the main reasons they bought the airline, because he was able to bring a bunch of innovative changes for the airline as well as better advertising, which made Continental grow by 500%. As the 1960s arrived, it would be during this time that Continental would enter its first golden age. To kick things off, the airline obtained the new Boeing 707 in the spring of 1959. This at first caused a few maintenance issues, as the airline had very few jets in its fleet at the time, meaning that they would need to have radical innovation. Six wasn't satisfied with the service of the plane and believed it could do better, so he turned the entire interior of the plane into one of the most luxurious standards in planes at the time. These planes would allow Continental to fly longer routes from coast to coast non-stop, such as from New York to Los Angeles. More jets, such as the DC-9 and the Boeing 727, became workhorses for the fleet as Continental became increasingly reliant on more modern jet aircraft and retired its turboprop aircraft. Continental would start their first international routes in 1965 with a 707-300 to Sydney, Australia and Auckland, New Zealand. In 1968, Continental would introduce a new livery with an iconic golden tail that would become the center of attention for its advertising campaign. That same year, they introduced their subsidiary, Air Micronesia, which had several island hopping routes to Guam, Saipan, Yap, Majuro, Rota, Truk, Ponap, and Honolulu using Fairchild F-27s. Additionally, Continental introduced new routes to the Pacific from Los Angeles, which further strengthened its presence in the South Pacific. Air Micronesia would continue to serve as an important Pacific subsidiary of the airline and would continue to operate 727s, DC-10s, and even 747s. Many retired Continental planes were sent straight to continental Micronesia in the mid-1990s, which allowed them to have longer routes in East and Southeast Asia. In 1970, the airline became one of the launch customers of the new Boeing 747 and the second airline to operate it domestically, with opening services beginning from Chicago to Denver to Los Angeles to Honolulu, with their new refined upper deck named the Polynesian Pub. 2 years later, in 1972, Continental introduced its second wide-body, the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, which seemed to be more popular with the airline, and they purchased more aircraft. There were several reasons why Continental chose the DC-10 over the 747, but one of the main reasons was that it could carry fewer people than the 747, which was important during a time of low passenger demand. It also had a shorter range, but the routes that Continental had at the time didn't require the extended range of the 747, and the plane would later be retired in 1976. Luckily, the Polynesian Pub was put inside the DC-10, but after the 1973 oil crisis, passenger levels rose, and it was removed. Continental would also retire their DC-9s in 1975 to modernize their fleet. By 1977, Continental was operating only two types of aircraft, the DC-10 and the 727. While it seemed that things were slowing down, something happened in 1978 that would change the aviation industry forever. In October 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed the Airline Deregulation Act, which would allow airlines to create new routes without the approval of the Civil Aeronautics Board. Continental took advantage of this and embarked on route expansion. They first expanded their routes to Denver, Houston, and Phoenix. The following year, in January, they began new routes from Los Angeles to Taipei and Honolulu. They even started linking up their hubs in Denver, Houston, and Washington, D.C. in June. However, the airline faced a major setback later that year after the DC-10 was grounded nationwide after the crash of American Airlines Flight 191. This was a problem for them, as they only operated the DC-10 and the 727 at the time, meaning they had to cancel all flights to Hawaii. As the 1980s came, this would be one of the most turbulent times for Continental, as in 1981, Frank Lorenzo's Texas Air Corporation took over the airline after their management's fierce battle with them, and problems emerged from the start. Alvin Feldman, the current CEO of Continental, who had been CEO of the airline since 1980, became very despondent after the acquisition and would later kill himself in his office on August 19, 1981. Lorenzo would later become the airline's CEO in March of 1982. Later in October, he merged the airline with Texas International, which gave Continental their DC-9s back and solidified their hub in Houston. Because of the deregulation, competition skyrocketed and fares were lowered, which put a big dent in the airline's profits. As a way to counter this, Continental began to cut costs and continue to expand its operations. But even when these changes were made, Continental faced a severe competitor threat in 1983 when American Airlines implemented two-tier wage structures with its unions. The airline would attempt to restructure labor costs, but to no avail. As the International Association of Mechanics and Aerospace Workers went on strike in August 1983, they were still able to operate because many mechanics crossed picket lines and Continental hired new mechanics. Negotiations with the workers went on for weeks, but with no agreement in the foreseeable future, Continental filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on September 24, 1983. Continental didn't improve, it only worsened. On October 1st, the pilots and the flight attendants joined the striking workers. The airline resumed services 3 days later, but they were only able to serve 25 cities instead of their available 70. They also had to switch up how their passengers had to travel. For example, people couldn't call their travel agents to book their flights, so the passengers had to book them directly, and since they couldn't accept credit cards, they only accepted cash for travel. The next year, the airline was able to emerge from this bankruptcy, and by the end of 1984, it had bounced back with a $50 million profit and had proven to be larger than it was pre-bankruptcy. Continental entered a bidding war with People Express on the purchase of a small Denver-based airline, Frontier. In late 1986, People Express was losing money, and Frontier filed for bankruptcy. Lorenzo later announced that Frontier, People Express, and Continental would merge to form the sixth largest airline in the world. A month later, Thomas Plaskett replaced Frank Lorenzo as CEO. On February 1st, 1987, the three airlines successfully merged, giving Continental a whole new fleet of airplanes, with the merger also seeing the return of the 747 in Continental's frame, albeit with second-hand airframes. In November 1987, Continental would face a severe blow to its reputation when a DC-9 crashed on takeoff in Denver. The NTSB investigation found the aircraft's de-icing equipment was not working properly, and the crew did not take adequate steps to address the icing conditions before takeoff. The crash was a major blow to Continental's reputation and led to increased scrutiny of the airline's safety practices. However, some good stuff would happen in 1988 when the airline entered into its first strategic partnership with Scandinavian Air System. In 1990, Eastern Airlines, an airline that was part of Texas Air, declared bankruptcy, and the management of the airline was removed due to their mismanagement. The company would also be $5.4 billion in debt and would, at this point, dedicate themselves to Continental Airlines, but they would never be able to recover because of its piling debt and poor reputation and would eventually dissolve. As the 1980s were drawing to a close and the 1990s were about to begin, Continental saw no huge progress, but the 1990s would change Continental from worst to first. The early 1990s would continuously see Continental dealing with harsh competition as well as getting lower and lower in performance. However, in 1994, Gordon Bethune became CEO of the airline, and he helped Continental fly its way back to the top of the airline industry. One of the first things Bethune did was create a new mission statement for the airline. He wanted to create a culture that put the customer first, so he made customer service a top priority. Bethune also implemented a new training program for employees to ensure they were providing exceptional service to passengers. This focus on customer service led to increased customer satisfaction and loyalty. Another key area for improvement was operations. Bethune worked to simplify processes and eliminate unnecessary bureaucracy, allowing the airline to operate more efficiently. He also invested in new technology to improve the booking process and reduce delays. These changes helped significantly improve the airline's on-time performance and reliability. Finally, Bethune was able to reduce costs by negotiating new contracts with suppliers and reducing employee benefits. He also sold off assets that were not critical to the core business, such as the airline's catering division. All of these factors, in turn, would make Continental go from being ranked last in many performance categories to winning more J.D. Power awards than any other airline. Businessweek magazine ranked Bethune as one of the top 25 global managers in the world, and the airline's stock price rose from $2 to $50. In 1998, Continental would go on to expand its international route network, using newly acquired 777s and 767s to introduce new flights to Tokyo and Tel Aviv from Newark. Other routes include Newark to Zurich as well as Cleveland to London. Continental seemed to be making quite a bit of a recovery from their recent disaster, but the turn of the century would prove to be the nail in the coffin for the airline. The turn of the century showed a sense of optimism for the aviation world, but right away, it proved to be the exact opposite. On September 11, 2001, 4 planes were hijacked and crashed into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania. This had an impact on the travel industry as a whole, and Continental was no exception. Travel demand plummeted, meaning not so many people were flying anymore, which, combined with the increased security measures imposed on airlines by the government, resulted in higher costs for the airline. Disputes with the pilots' unions would also start to rise, but Bethune was able to counter this by reaching an agreement with them in 2002. This would be crucial to establishing labor stability, and it seemed to reignite a period of profitability, a period in which from 2003 to 2008 was mostly problem-free. Some of the most notable things that happened during this period were their entry into the SkyTeam Alliance and the opening of new routes to China and India. They had even surpassed Northwest Airlines in terms of passenger traffic in 2006, making them the 4th largest carrier in the U.S. However, Gordon Bethune would step down as CEO of the airline in 2004, but in his place, Larry Kilner would continue the positive momentum and strategies Bethune had embedded in the airline. Even though Continental had started seeing more of another redemption, that would all change, although this time they wouldn't be able to come back from it, because it was 2008, meaning it was time for the global financial crisis. Due to the rising fuel prices because of the crisis, they sold their remaining 4.38 million share investment to Copa Airlines, cut 3,000 jobs, and reduce wages. They would also retire 67 aircraft from the fleet by the end of 2009 and express their merger plans with United Airlines. The two airlines had been in merger talks since mid-2007, but this time they felt that the time was right to officially merge. Over the next year, Continental continued to focus on enhancing the performance of their planes as well as developing new in-flight entertainment systems. They had also placed orders for the Boeing 787, although these would later be passed on to United. 2010 would be the start of the integration process between the two, with UAL Corporation and Continental Airlines first merging on October 1st to form United Continental Holdings. The following year, operating certificates for Continental Micronesia, as well as operations for the two, began to merge. And on November 30th, Continental began using the call sign United, with the two officially merging and Continental no longer operating as a separate airline. On March 3rd, 2012, Continental Flight 1267 conducted the last flight for the airline from Phoenix to Cleveland, thus ending 74 years of the airline's service. With this video drawing to a close, we'll explain the legacy the airline has had on aviation. When Continental merged with United, it made them the third largest airline in the world, behind American and Delta Airlines. They're also a prime example of an airline that can have an initial rise but a drastic downfall, to the point where it seemed it was over for them, only for them to be rescued by a man who was able to transform them into one of the most prestigious airlines in the world. Even some of the harshest financial crises in the world weren't able to stop them from improving themselves. So, if we were to analyze the years that led to Continental's demise, their merger wasn't necessarily a downfall, but rather a more proactive response to the challenges and opportunities in the airline industry during that time, and this would certainly succeed.